Hi, welcome to a special section on the principal parts of a Greek verb, which we have learned already when we went over the video, how to study Greek vocabulary. But now that you've learned more grammar since that time, and we've just finished chapter 24, I want to fill in some more information about how the 6 principal parts work. You'll need to know this not just for this chapter and the next chapter, but the 6 principal parts actually forms the basis of learning for the entire semester. So this is something you simply must learn, and you cannot consider it as optional. So please take this learning activity very seriously. I posted, along with this video, a handout. And that handout contains all the slides that you'll see in this instructional video, plus more. There's more information in the handout than there is in this instructional video. In this instructional video, I'm only going to give a handful of examples, but once you see these examples in use, you'll be able to do the entire worksheet. So far, for the tenses we've learned, for the grammar you've learned the present tense, you've learned the future tense, you learned the aorist tense, and you've also not only learned the future and aorist tenses in the active middle forms, but you also learned the aorist passive forms, which are special and separate from the active middle forms. So the only tense that we have to cover is the perfect tense, which is covered in chapter 25, both its active form and its middle passive forms. So these are something we have not learned yet, and you don't have to learn now, so I'm going to cross this out. But you have learned the present, the future, the aorist forms, active, middle, and passive. And the idea of the 6 principal parts is, once you learn all 6 forms, the present, the active, the future active, the aorist active, eventually by the next module, the perfect active, the perfect middle passive, and for this week we learned the aorist passive forms. Once you learn these 6 forms are the basis for the entire Greek verb system. It doesn't matter what vocabulary word you learn, you have to learn the vocabulary word and also memorize not just the lexical form and not just the verbal root. Memorize these, but you need to memorize the present active stem, which is basically the lexical stem. They're one and the same. The future active stem, the aorist active stem, the aorist passive stems. That's what you're responsible for now after chapter 24. But after next week, when you learn chapter 25, you'll also be responsible for the perfect active and the perfect middle passive stems. Let me clear the board and end by saying that these stems, the present active stem, the future active stem, the aorist active stem, and the aorist passive stems, the one you learned so far, and eventually the perfect active and the perfect middle passive form the basis for all the other tenses in the Greek verb system. So if I know the present active stem, I can give you all the forms for the present active, middle, passive, indicative, and the imperfect active, middle, and passive, indicative. The imperfect tense is based off of the present tense stem. If I know the future active stem, then I can give you all the forms for the future active indicative and the future middle indicative, but not the passive. Passive's not included here because the future passive is built not off of the future active stem, but actually off of the aorist passive stem. And then if I know the aorist active stem, I can form the basis for the aorist active indicative and all the forms for the aorist middle indicative. But again, this is not the stem for the aorist passive forms. We will learn what the perfect active and the perfect middle passive can do later, next week. And the aorist passive stem, which is its own unique form, and we just learned this, is the basis for all the forms for the aorist passive indicative and the aorist passive, future passive indicative. And so knowing the first person singular forms for the present active, future active, aorist passive is important because these are the stems from which, these are the building blocks from which all the other tenses are made. So again, don't forget, you want to download the handout on the principal parts that accompanies this instructional video. I've listed here all the forms of luo you should already know. And then you learned this week the future passive forms, the aorist passive forms. Please fill that out. And you will learn in the next module the perfect forms. So what I want you to do then is, for this worksheet, please fill out all the aorist passive forms. Memorize the aorist passive form, the first person singular aorist passive indicative form, as part of your vocabulary. So you already know the present active form, the future active form, the aorist active forms, these principal parts. So I filled the chart out for you for the forms that you've already studied. But this should be something that you should review. You should actually be able to go through every vocabulary word, like luo, or peruamai, or blepo, or grapho. And you should be able to name the present active for singular form, the imperfect form, which is in brackets, and it's listed here because the imperfects always use the lexical or present active stem. And you should be able to list the first person singular form for the future active and the first person singular form for the aorist active for every verb. But there are some vocabulary where you simply cannot anticipate what the form will be because it has an irregular form. So look at, for example, the word ago, which is I lead. And ago is I'm leading. Agon is I was leading. So far they're following the normal rules. It looks just like luo. Oxo is also something we'd expect, knowing our rules for stops. That's I will lead. But look at what's shaded here in yellow, or highlighted here in yellow. This is a second aorist form, and the stem is something that you can't anticipate. So a gagon is an irregular way to say I led, is an irregular form, and I'm just going to have to memorize this. It's because when I memorize the vocabulary word ago, I'm going to memorize not just ago and the verbal as the lexical form, and not just og as the verbal root, but I'm going to know the imperfect agon. I'm memorizing that first person form. I'm memorizing oxo. I'm going to memorize agagon as the second aorist active form, and I'm going to memorize eichthane, although this is something we would expect. I'm going to memorize eichthane as the aorist passive form. So as you go through this chart, please review the forms you should already know, the present active, future active, and aorist active, and fill in all the aorist passive forms. So when you go through the handout, notice that I've divided the verbs into groups. I've given you regular verbs. I've also given you verbs with stops. And I've also given you contract verbs. And just by way of review, remember, contract verbs, you only see vowel contraction for this column, for the present tense and the imperfect tense. That's where all the big 5 little 2 rules have to be applied. It's right here. It's just this column. But for all the other tenses, all you have to do is apply the rule of compensatory lengthening, which is making the short vowel long. And so it's relatively easy to form all the other tenses because it's very regular, very predictable. All you have to do is remember these compensatory lengthening vowels, and then you'll be just fine. Here's a chart showing all the contractions. So this is the present tense, the present, and here are the imperfect forms for the contract verbs, and along with luo here as a way to compare them with the contract forms. So it's really, again, the present and the imperfect forms where vowel contraction comes in for contract verbs, And then the rest of the principal parts is easy. Another type of verb that we go over are liquid verbs. So make sure that you go over the liquid verbs, and remember that the aorist form and active form has a different tense formative. We learned for this chapter the liquid futures. So I left this blank. Fill in all the liquid futures for the liquid verbs that you learned. Fill in all the aorist passive forms for the liquid futures that you learned. Remembering that some liquid verbs undergo stem change in the aorist tense, and in the future it uses the tense formative S. And then finally, for the irregular forms, you're really going to have to memorize the principal parts, because many of these irregular verbs use a verbal root that you don't anticipate, that's really different from everything else. And even after that, they might do things that you don't anticipate in the tense. So I went ahead and filled out most of principal parts that you already know. Again, you're responsible for filling out the aorist passives and any liquid forms that are left blank for you to fill in. And so with that, go ahead and fill out the entire handout. And as you do it, review, memorize for each vocabulary word, its lexical form, its first person imperfect forms, its first person future active forms, first person singular aorist active forms, and for this week's module, the aorist passive forms. And then you'll learn the other two principal parts next week.